So welcome everybody to this afternoon's session on our final day of Journalism and Media Week. Today I'm joined by Neil and Rob Gibbons, the creators of Alan Partridge. Alan Partridge is one of the most iconic creations in British comedy. His unique brand of chat was first brought to our attention on BBC Radio 4's On the Hour in 1991, co-created by Steve Coogan and Armando Iannucci. Although Richard Herring will always say he created Alan Partridge, if you believe him, in his Leicester City, Leicester Square Theatre podcast. A year later, Alan got his own radio chat show, We Know Me, Knowing You, with Alan Partridge, which transferred to BBC Two in 1994. In 1997, Alan moved to the Linton Travel Tavern for his first series of I'm Alan Partridge, followed by Static Caravan Adventures in Series 2, and then he had an 8-year career break for much soul-searching, and returned with Mid-Morning Matters, penned by our guests, Neil and Rob Gibbons. Since then, he's been very busy with 2 audiobooks, a major film in Alpha Papa, a return to TV in prime time, with this time of Alan Partridge, and sidestepping into the world of podcasting with a brilliant From the Oast House. And also a return to his live roots in a major UK arena tour earlier this year. The Guardian critic Brian Logan stated Partridge was now at the centre of his own thriving multi-platform metaverse, something I'll pick up on later. So, firstly, welcome to Neil and Rob. Thank you for joining us in what is obviously a very busy schedule for you. Just want to first ask you, how did 2 lads from Sandbach end up writing and having creative control of one of the most popular figures in British comedy history?
I'm afraid it's a very boring story. There's almost nothing interesting in it whatsoever. We had a couple of scripts that we'd written and we're trying to punt around, and our agent just sent it to Steve Coogan's company, and he sort of liked our sensibilities. He felt that we matched up quite well with the stuff that he likes, and he asked us to write a sort of comeback episode for another character that he used to do called Paul and Pauline Calf, and we wrote that. It didn't really go anywhere, but we were sort of on his radar at that point, and when he brought back Alan for Mid-Morning Matters, he just needed other writers. I think it was right place, right time, really.
Rob, anything to...
I would say that, by the way, just for context for me, could you just quickly tell me what it's a television production course, just so I know what you guys are...
So it's a range of journalism courses, so straight journalism, sports journalism, TV production, film, there might be some creative and professional writers in the room as well, so
okay.
quite a mix, broad, sort of, but all media related, basically. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So just so I but forgive me in that case if some of what we say about the industry and stuff is already you know it all already. But stop me if we're saying stuff that's sort of too obvious. But yeah, the way the industry works in the UK, if you want to write comedy on TV, is that there are, or at least when we started 2 decades ago, there were quite a small number of companies that make sitcoms for the BBC and Channel 4 and ITV and Sky. And so your job as a new writer is to try and get something you've written just in front of the right people. And the difficulty with that is that these companies have people who just read scripts that might not produce stuff, but their job is just to sort of be a gatekeeper, because these companies are so inundated with scripts from people who want to be writers that you go into their offices and they literally just have piles and piles, they have mountains of scripts on their desks. So getting your thing read is the hardest thing. And I don't know, maybe we'll go on to talk about some of this later, but the best thing to do these days is to try and make a little bit of something, even if it's just with your own equipment and friends, a 5-minute bit of something, because it's just much easier for a producer to click play than to sit down and read a half-hour script. But that's by the by. So as Neil said, that one of our scripts got put in front of Steve Coogan, and he felt like there was similarity there in tone and style and where the jokes were coming from with his kind of his own sensibilities. And so, yeah, we managed to get in front of him and started writing bits and pieces for a live show that Steve did. He did a live show many years ago, 15 years ago, where he was doing, it was an evening where he did all of his characters, but focusing on Alan Partridge, his main character. And so that was our entry into Alan Partridge. We were submitting material for him to sort of for consideration for that tour. And not when we went to watch the tour, when it came to London at the end of the run, it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that all the stuff we'd submitted, he wasn't using. He was using stuff he'd written or other people had written. And we were there was like a drinks thing in the bar of the theatre afterwards. And so we were there kind of standing nervously in the corner, slightly embarrassed really that our stuff didn't seem to have passed muster. And he came over to us and said, I need to apologise because the stuff that you were sending in was pitch perfect had we been making this for television. But because I was performing in front of a live audience every night, the type of jokes I needed were more traditional set-up punchline jokes, and you were writing stuff that was more about the character. He said, but if I ever bring Alan Partridge back to TV, I'd love you to write it with me. And so we thanked him and went on our way, and then got out of the bar and just looked at each other and said, well, that's just a bloke who's being nice to us, and that will obviously never happen. Let's just crack on with our own stuff. But sure enough, a few months later, Foster's Lager were putting money into comedy as a way to try and appear cool. And so they I think, I don't know if it was about bringing back old characters, but Reeves and Mortimer did some stuff on the Foster's Comedy Channel, and some others did. And we ended up with Steve bringing back Alan Partridge in as a radio host in a thing called Mid Morning Matters in that format. So it was just online. So it was kind of a soft entry back into the world for Alan because it was the Foster's Comedy website. Obviously, who the hell is going to watch that? So it wasn't really watched by many people. But for us, it was quite the gentlest of ways into it, really, because there's pressure, obviously, in trying to write Alan Partridge. Especially, we were relatively new writers, so especially for us. And that was a nice way not to be exposed to all the critics and millions of BBC viewers. But this is a very long way of saying that what we found, to our surprise, was that when we started doing Partridge, Steve was almost treated us like equals. And so me and Neil and Steve would be in the writing room. The way the writing process tends to work, and maybe we'll go on to talk more about this, but it's quite improvisational. So we'll just be speaking sort of in Alan's voice and coming up with Alan lines, and that's how we tend to start building scripts. And it's kind of nerve-wracking speaking in Alan Partridge's voice in front of Alan Partridge. But Steve was amazingly generous in not being sort of territorial about a character that, is totally his creation and is him, and he'd successfully become famous off the back of. But there was none of that proprietorialness at all, which really helped us feel more confident and ultimately to take a bit of ownership over it and get to the position we are with it now, where we've, sort of been what we've been doing for the best part of a decade.
Thank you very much. That was a very complete and compelling answer, which also will link into some of the other issues I want to raise this afternoon. Who were your sort of comedy writing influences when you were growing up, or your formative years as writers? Who did you look to and think, yeah, that's a fantastic character, or a really tightly written script?
We loved things like Folly Towers, Porridge, Likely Lads. Loved all the Chris Morris's stuff, obviously. We were, Partridge fans as well, but we didn't really have that sort of encyclopedic knowledge of the character, which I think probably helped. It meant that we weren't sort of trying to, ape something that closely. We sort of had to kind of find our way with the character. We sort of helped to kind of reinvent him slightly. Who else, Rob? Who else?
I guess I'm a big fan of Seinfeld, and they're sort of tonally unlike Partridge, but the scripts, there's just no, what do you call it? There's no fat in those scripts at all. They are so utterly ruthless in that writing process of ejecting anything that isn't top quality, which is sounds like it's an obvious thing to do, but it's the hard thing about that is sometimes you can spot the bits that are weaker, but it's replacing them with bits that are as good as the good bits. That's obviously the hard thing. And Seinfeld managed to do it for, I don't know, 200 odd episodes, so amazing.
Thank you. My MA dissertation was on British sitcom writing partnerships, and you mentioned quite a few of the ones I looked at, like Fawlty Towers and Clement and Frene and Croft and Perry, and you know all those sort of major sort of from the 50s, Hancock's Half Hour forward, really, you know, golden period, wasn't it, for British comedy, particularly partnerships. What is it, do you think, that's so special about writing comedy in a partnership or working with your sibling, as opposed to the American model of, you know, where things are written in much larger sort of groups and jokes are kind of, you know, stylized out a little bit? How do you approach your work, and what do you think is that special bond of writing in a partnership?
I think sometimes if the team expands too much, it becomes a bit of a sort of production line of gags, and you kind of lose a singular voice in your character. It becomes a sort of kind of almost a mathematical exercise of setting jokes up and paying them off, you know, and so the almost the fewer people, the better, in terms of sort of retaining hold of the sort of essence of the comedy that you're going for. However, if you're on your own, I do think sometimes that you're slightly feeling your way in the dark. You're never quite sure whether a joke that tickles you is going to really land. So yeah, the good thing about partnership is you've got a ready-made sounding board, and if you have a close relationship anyway, which obviously we do, it means that you don't have to tread on eggshells when you're slagging off someone else's work. You can be quite brutal in the notes you give, so there's this kind of rapid shorthand. But I also think the important thing is not having exactly the same comedy minds, because then all you're really doing is doubling up. We sort of have slightly different sensibilities, so it means that we kind of bring different things to the table, and you know, you build something that's greater than the sum of its parts that way. But yeah, it's hard to say really, because we've only ever written there's two of us, so we've never really sort of struck out on our own. This is all we know.
Sometimes though it's useful when we'll often be doing, me and Neil will often be doing the writing on Partridge, but we also do it, some of it with Steve, and that's a useful process, simply because when it's me and Neil, or any two people who disagree on something and then put it to a vote, it's obviously always ending in a draw, so you don't resolve whether you keep joke X in the script or not. But three of us, me, Neil and Steve, can always go to a vote, and then you can always get an answer. And sometimes when the pressure's on, it can be as simple as that, as a reason to do it in a 3 rather than a 2, and a reason why doing it not on your own is helpful.
Thanks. How do you keep track of the ever-expanding AP universe? I mean, do you keep copious notes, or do you have a researcher? Because I've noticed some really subtle crossovers between sort of mid-morning matters, you know, thematically, and the Oast House. So how do you sort of keep control of that world?
Primarily, Neil has a brilliant memory, and I don't. And then further along the scale of bad memory, you get to Steve, who regularly make a joke in the writing room as a suggestion for a line, and you'll have to explain that, well, that was done in the previous series, or in that book, or in that, and he just won't remember. So a lot of it is quite simply down to Neil's memory. But I think one of the things we did was a mock autobiography called Partridge, and I think we might have had a bit of help from a researcher on that, putting together a big document of Alan's sort of key facts document. But it's difficult. I mean, nevertheless, yeah, when you've been creating and building out a character for so long, it's sort of it's kind of an experiment in writing, really, because it's not. Most people haven't done this with a character, probably because they had the good sense just to move on to something else, and we haven't. But yeah, somebody said on the other day, maybe on Twitter, it's a bit like a sort of comedy version of a Richard Linklater film, which isn't really fair on Linklater, but sort of get the idea. It's quite a weird thing, not only to have been writing character for so long, but also to put him in so many different genres. Which is, Basil Fawlty, he's just staying in that hotel, isn't he? And most characters stay where they're in the cité of the comp. Partridge has been in all sorts of places and all sorts of genres, which is kind of unusual.
Yeah, I mean, I must say, it's now getting to the stage where we are making more continuity errors. Just the volume of material just means that it's very hard not to do that. And you'll always see people, on Twitter picking you up on stuff saying, I thought you said he was married at this church and now you've named it as this church in a later thing. And you can't get too hung up on that. I have to say we don't massively give a shit about things like that because there's more important things, it's a comedy character and it has to be funny. But yeah, some people are very, very heavily invested in the timeline of Alan and the world we've created, which is nice, but they should also get out more.
Well, we did a film version of Alan Partridge called Alpha Papa 10 or so years ago, and it just so happened that when the day came in pre-production when we were working out the wig he should wear, we just decided, why don't we just give him hair that's just slightly longer than his normal wig? And so that was the wig we went with. And quite a lot of people, when the film came out, were just enraged by that. Quite a few diehard fans were like, well, we've made a mistake there because Alan's hair isn't that long. And they just seemed unable to factor in that hair can grow. They just weren't having it. His hair's not that long, so I didn't like it. Didn't like the film.
But yeah, no, it's quite a useful way to cover up for the other shortcomings in the film to have people fixate on that.
Cool. Obviously, Alan Partridge is driven by Steve's performance and your skills as writers, but at its heart for me, it's always been quite an ensemble piece, and Alan bouncing off those other characters. So you've got, obviously, Alan's long-suffering PA, Lynn. You've got the much-missed Michael, obviously. We've got Psychic Simon. We've got, his co-host, Jenny. How integral are those characters in shaping the story?
Well, they give Alan a reason to talk for a start. I mean, he's a broadcaster, so he can always, spout his stuff into a microphone. But the kind of personal life, the kind of private Alan, he needs someone to say that stuff too. And it helps if they are a slight kind of weather vane for the things that annoy him, because then he can, he can be talking to them and his prejudices and his neuroses will come out through conversation. The tricky thing always with those secondary characters is you want them to be characters who are funny in their own right, but if they are unreal, then Alan just becomes unreal as well. If you have someone who has heightened comedy characteristics, it normally helps to put them in a very real space, because otherwise you don't really get a handle on what's funny about them because you created an odd plane of reality. So normally you try and put a heightened comedy character alongside someone who's real. We've tried to sort of tread that tightrope quite carefully, that creating someone who feels like they might be a real person, but also has a kind of an idiosyncrasy or an oddness to them that makes them work as a comedy character as well. So they're not just providing feeder lines for Alan to say something offensive or daft.
Thank you very much. In this time for me, one of the funniest sort of running jokes was Alan's increasingly awkward interaction with the studio audience who were there to watch this time. how much within those scenes, and you kind of touched on this already, how much is that formed organically, or are there meticulous kind of rewrites and fine-tuning, quite close up to actually sort of shooting the show?
Yeah, the process of writing, going from the initial idea to what we actually record is in many ways it's not a good process for your mental health, because what we'll tend to do is write a script, and then it will get to the day of filming, and a lot of it will have to be rewritten sort of there and then, and because what's the way through this, Neil, where I can sort of be diplomatic? I mean,
no, I don't think so. No, just say it.
Yeah, Steve will sometimes, and you'll find this with, I think, really, really brilliant comic performers quite often, from going back to Peter Sellers to whoever down the generations, that I think sometimes they can have that kind of mind where they find it hard if they've come up with something funny in the writing room, and a few weeks or months pass, and then you get to the morning of recording it, they will have seen that funny line enough times that they know the joke, and so it stops being funny to them. And what happens then is they start to become anxious that it's not funny, and then they decide, well, we can't have stuff in it that's not funny, so we need to replace this with something that is funny. And that will often, and Steve is not alone in this, this is very typical in the industry of people who are writer performers and have, are sort of very sort of high functioning and sort of the top of their game, but they'll have this anxiety there. Well, what if that thing isn't funny? It doesn't feel funny to me anymore, and that can mean that we can turn up on a day of filming and have to rewrite quite a lot of stuff, and that is really hard. And what sometimes happens is that it's easy to confuse a joke that's new with a joke that's better than what you already have. And so what I mean by that is sometimes you come up with a line on the day and you can convince yourself that's funnier than what we already have, and it isn't, it's just fresher. And so I remember Richard Curtis, when he was first writing Blackadder, he'd do his first draft, and the lines that he thought were the funniest he would just circle, so that when the time came when he'd read it 20 times and no longer found it funny, that was just a little device for him to go, no, have faith in that, trust your initial judgment, because often that's the right judgment to go with. So we should do more of the circling. But yes, that's a long way of saying that we will do lots of rewriting up to the point of the cameras turning over, but what we won't do is improvise on camera. And so we will fine-tune everything from the words to the individual syllables to the raise of the eyebrow. We'll do everything from the big to the tiny detail up to the point of the cameras turning over, but we won't then be making stuff up when we're shooting.
Following the success of the audiobooks, did it seem a natural progression to discuss developing a full podcast series with Alan as a centre?
I think that we were just approached by a company saying that, I think it was Spotify originally, came to us with the idea of doing an Alan Partridge podcast. It's not something that we'd particularly thought should be the next move for Alan. But it kind of gave us faith that Alan would work, away from a radio or TV studio. The fact that we've done the books, which are very kind of, they can be quite meandering, and it takes a lot of long, unnecessary digressions. We did see from writing the books that there was merit in that. So it just, not to denigrate podcasting at all, but you could argue that 90% of podcasts are a digression from what they should be talking about. So yeah, there's a sort of rambling quality to podcasting that sort of jives quite well with Alan.
Are there any plans to resurrect any of Steve's other comic creations? So would you ever consider revisiting Tommy Saxondale or any of the others within either TV or a different sort of mode of delivery?
Well, it's not really our call on that. Paul Incarf, Ernest Moss, Tommy Saxondale, they're all Steve's creations, and he kind of owns them. If he wants to bring them back, he would probably have to approach the people he wrote those with. No, there's been no talk of that really at all. I think one albatross around his neck is enough.
Your latest project, The Witchfinder, is obviously a very different concept, very different time period. Is historical comedy something you've always been interested in, or is that organically just come about of things you've written before, or is it a project you've had on the sort of back burner for a while?
No, we're not. Go on, Rob. Sorry.
There was never a specific interest from us in doing historical comedy, but when we landed on the central idea for it, which it was a show about set in the 1640s in the east of England, and it was about a central character who was a witch finder, whose job it was to find witches, take them to trial, and our series is about him going to a village where he has to take a witch across Anglia to a big trial, and it becomes a sort of odd couple road trip where they are, like all odd couples, our main character and our witch are just completely unsuited to each other and rub each other up the wrong way. So that's the central idea. So really the idea of two people who are stuck together, who are dissimilar and so rub up against each other comically, that could have been applied and put in anywhere really in any time period, but it just felt to us like we could say something about the modern day by setting it back in the 1640s, because there are obvious similarities in the way that people in those days had a sort of what you might call sort of Daily Mail attitude to people who were different to them. So it just felt like when we were coming up with that idea, the kind of things that were going on in the country at the time felt like they lend themselves to a story in the 1640s. Sort of paradoxical as that might sound, there were enough similarities that we thought, well, what we were trying to do as writers is write funny stuff, but generally a commissioner at a station won't just commission something that's funny. They'll want it to, in some way, the more subtle the better, but in some way say something about the country or about an issue that's relevant to people today.
Okay, cheers. Daisy May Cooper obviously co-starred with Tim Key in that show. And obviously her stars in The Ascendancy after the brilliant Am I Being Unreasonable, which is, I think, one of the first, sitcom thrillers. I don't know what it is. It's a hybrid kind of thing, but it's a fantastic twist at the end. If audience have not seen it, please do watch it. Available on BBC Three. We've also had the brilliant double BAFTA winning Alma's Not Normal by Sophie Willan, which is, again, absolute tour de force of comedy. Raw, engaging, incredibly personal. And Sarah Pascoe's work Out of Her Mind. Are we finally seeing a levelling up in comedy, which was a very male, and is a very male-dominated genre? So are you kind of optimistic that the kind of other voices are now being heard?
I think so. I think the TV industry is it's still not a level playing field, but then no industry is yet. But it feels to me, from our position, that it's making strides more quickly than lots of other industries. And I mean, the examples you gave there are prominent ones, but there are many others, I think, in front of and behind the camera, where you get much more of a sense that it's thankfully ceasing to be a sort of club for white blokes. And the faster that can happen, obviously, the better for the world, and also better for comedy, really, because more interesting stories, more different points of view, different styles of comedy. It'd just be a richer world of comedy.
Yeah, I think there's still certain roles are still very male heavy. Directors, there's not that many female directors. Editors, directors of photography, they're all very skewed very heavily towards men. I don't know why. I don't know why they're sort of lagging behind writing and performing. But yeah, so there's still some way to go.
Okay, thanks. So that's end of my questions. I'm going to hand it over to the audience behind me.
Hi guys.
Hello.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to ask you about comedy writing. I saw the film Thor: Love and Thunder back when it came out in cinemas, and people have been calling it Death by a Thousand Jokes because of just the bombarding amount of jokes that were coming, and they were just not funny anymore. How do you make your jokes pop when you deliver them and you're writing them?
Well, I think one of the for us, one of our ways of trying to make sure that the jokes stay funny is making sure the characters are good and the stories are interesting, because I think there are certain writers out there who there's one very successful one who I won't name, but he will write a script, it'll get made, he'll then go along to sort of test screenings, and where there are bits where there are bits where people sort of stop laughing, he'll just mark that in the script, and then he'll go away and they'll do reshoots and substitute the stuff where people weren't laughing for hopefully better stuff. And what I find when I watch this person's stuff, and you'll see it, I think, quite a lot. I think the example you're talking about is probably a similar case in point, where jokes will stop being funny if the context around them isn't sort of truthful and interesting, and they are not doing a job to move an interesting story forward. So I think it's all about making sure that your characters are interesting even when they're not telling jokes, and the story has something interesting going on. What do you think, Neil?
No, I agree. Yeah, I think if a joke sort of exists in a sort of airless environment, then it stops being funny. I think it has to sort of propel something. Normally with our work, it is, what does it say about the character, and it sort of has to kind of come from character. But yeah, it has to do a job, I think, and it has to. Yeah, you have to sort of treat it almost as a piece of music, with sort of slow bits, fast bits, quiet bits, loud bits. You have to kind of do the groundwork to allow a joke to properly pop. We all know those sort of shaggy dog jokes where it kind of goes on and on and on and on and on, and you start getting bored of it. And then the longer it goes on, the more kind of bang for its buck the punchline has. So yeah, it's generally the way we treat it is it funny first and foremost, but also does it say something about the character? Does it help the story? Does it help Foster's to sell lager? And if it does all of those, then it's a home run.
Thanks, David. Hello. I was lucky enough to be able to see the recent arena tour, and I was really fascinated by the way that it still felt personal, intimate, and very Partridge, but at the same time really made use of the theatrical space that you had available to you, especially in kind of like a multimedia way. Just what was the process behind that? Was it an absolute nightmare to make use of all of these different theatrical tools, or was it just a pleasure to use those? What was that like?
Where did you see it?
I saw it in Leeds, so I saw it in the First Director Arena here.
Right, of course, yeah. That was. I'm just thinking where that was. That was sort of about halfway through the run, I think. I'm asking that question because one of the interesting or difficult things about doing the live tour was how much it changed over the course of the first half of the run. It finished in London. By the time it got to London, it was quite a different beast than when we started out in Belfast a few weeks before. And I think just to quickly explain what the tour was, it was kind of Alan Partridge giving a presentation of his own self-help system, and that was the loose conceit that held it together. And from that point, it jumped off to anything else that we thought was funny or that would give it a bit of variety. And that was something we were very aware of when we were writing this 2-hour show, that it's important to have a central idea, which is making it more interesting for people than just Alan saying stuff that makes you cringe. But also that sometimes it's as simple as keeping different things happening. So have something funny happen, then move on to a different thing that's funny in a different way, then move on to a different thing that's funny in a different way, because it becomes very obvious very quickly when you're live in front of 20,000 people, when you've lost people's attention. And it was bad enough for me and Neil sensing that in some of the early shows, but for Steve on stage, I mean, I can't imagine anything worse. And so we had all that in place with those ideas of a central concept and lots of variety. But nevertheless, when the show opened, over the course of the first week, we were changing stuff and taking quite a lot of stuff out at quite a rate. So I think that the show went down from being 2 hours, 2 hours 10 to an hour and a bit by the time it got to London, because it's just, and it's a gift in a way, because when you're writing stuff for telly, you think it's funny, you hope it's funny, but by the time you find out, well, it's aired, or maybe you don't find out because you're not watching it with all the viewers, but when you're in front of all those people and something you thought was funny is met with silence, it's a pretty easy decision just to take it out for the next night.
Yeah, the other thing was that a surprising number of people who go to watch an Alan Partridge live show don't have a great deal of interest in Alan Partridge. So you have to hold their attention as well as the sort of die-hard fans' attention. So, it meant that the variety and kind of theatrics, not in a sort of cynical way, but they have to form part of the show so that people, it holds their interest as well as the, more obsessive fans.
Thank you.
Jason.
So I just wanted to ask about Alpha Papa. So there's a whole history of sitcoms turned into movies in Britain, from on the buses onwards. So we're just wondering about the sort of constraints or challenges of writing Alan Partridge for a new format for film, and in terms of, in what ways was it different and had to appeal to an audience beyond the die-hard TV fans, how was it different to the other formats, platforms you've used?
It is different. Just by virtue of kind of being on the big screen, it has to sort of earn its place there, which means that, if you like, the sort of smaller ideas that are normally the comic engine for Alan, dismantling a trouser press or picking someone up on, the bad use of grammar, you can't sustain the film with things like that. You have to, paint a more colourful picture on a bigger canvas. So, but at the same time, you don't want to lose the DNA of what makes people love Alan. So we wanted it to be bigger, but still feel, like it's part of Alan's world. So we knew very quickly that we weren't going to take Alan to Vegas or, on a big road trip around Europe. We wanted it to be in Norfolk, in his world of local radio broadcasting, but give it the jeopardy that helps to make it feel like a film. So that was something that we had to think long and hard about. But the other thing is that generally with a film, it's because it's a single story, you will take the character on a kind of journey of learning. They'll have a kind of character deficiency at the start of the film that they sort of overcome and fix through the course of the journey that they go on. You can't really do that with a comedy character because you're taking away the failings that make them funny in the first place. But at the same time, you have to kind of pay lip service to it. So all we did really with the film was have Alan say at the end of the film, I really think I've changed. And the very fact he's saying that tells you that, of course, he hasn't changed. It means you can reset and still, keep him as Alan for the next outing.
Oh, further, hang on. There's a test, mate.
Hello. I was lucky enough to see the live show as well. I saw it in Nottingham. I just wondered which bit you thought was the funniest out of the show.
We did a bit where there was a character we'd done on TV, which was Steve playing an Irish guy. We did Alan interviewing that character in the live tour. So that was my favourite bit. I find it sort of easy to make judgments on stuff that I didn't write, and that was almost entirely written by Neil. And Neil has this way of something I could never do, where he'll just seemingly write a few pages of dialogue that is just so good that you can't make any improvements to it in about half an hour. And that Neil can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like that came out of him quite quickly. And when I look at the stuff that we've made over the years, sometimes stuff that we might have come up with between takes might be something I find a really funny moment, but quite often, maybe I'm just saying this because I'm coming from a writer's point of view, but I find that the stuff that I find most satisfying and funny is stuff that came out onto the page and hasn't been tinkered with or fiddled with between being written and being filmed.
Hi guys.
Yes, that's also my favourite bit. There you go. Because I wrote it.
It's okay. Obviously, Alan Partridge was like 90s and stuff, and a lot of comedies talked about. In this day and age, with the cancel culture going around and afraid of offending anyone, has it made it harder for comedy writers to write decent, good comedy scripts in today's world?
So I didn't hit it.
It's about cancel culture. Cancel culture. Is that environment made it harder to write comedy?
Well, it probably has for some people. I think Alan has always kind of skirted that line. So he's. I think the current iteration of Alan is someone who is terrified of cancel culture, and we've sort of fed that into his character. So he's someone who, does make missteps in what he says, but he kind of, in trying to fix it, you hopefully get another joke out of it. We've always sort of been aware of that Alan should be the sort of target of the jokes, or someone who is, in a position of the establishment or a position of power. And if Alan does offend minorities, it's the joke, hopefully, is that Alan is trying and failing to kind of be politically correct, which is something that doesn't come naturally to a man of his generation. So yeah, we haven't struggled with cancel culture that much. In fact, my general view on cancel culture is that the people who get cancelled, by and large, deserve it. So that may be pride before a fall, maybe it'll come to us soon. But I can imagine it's made the job of comedy writing harder for some people, but it's not been that much of a challenge for us.
I just wanted to, first of all, I just want to say thank you very much for talking to everybody here today, Neil and Rob. For me, I think From the Oast House is the best that Partridge has ever been. I wanted to ask you where you take Partridge now and what formats do you think he is going to do next. I'm wondering if a game show is on the lines, maybe you can resurrect Skirmish. I'm just wondering where else do you take Partridge, and what do you think you and Coogan could come up with?
Funnily enough, we did have a bit of the live show where Alan does a game show and he gets people up from the audience, and it was just really shit. So it never saw the light of day. We canned it quite early. We're sort of currently scratching our heads and trying to figure out what is the next stage for Alan. He's sort of had his second kind of flirtation with fame, and he made it onto the BBC presenting a kind of a sort of one show kind of show. But at the end of the second series, we decided we wanted to, sever that tie. So he basically kind of talked himself out of the job and ended up outside the BBC and having lost the job. So now he's kind of back down to very much a local level, looking at the sort of world of celebrity from the outside, which is a kind of better fit for him, I think. But as to what happens next for him, we're still trying to solve that particular puzzle. He's definitely coming back. We are commissioned already to write another series, but we're just trying to work out what form it should take.
Well, I think sadly we've come to the end of our session today, so a big round of applause please for Neil and Rob Gibbons. Thank you very much.